Nobody in Sherman County expected to wake up running for their lives, but sometime after midnight on May 18th, in a mountainous stretch of Hunan Province that most people outside of China have never heard of, the rain that had been falling for days finally crossed a line that the earth could no longer absorb. Everything that happened after that point happened fast, and it happened all at once. By the time the sun came up over Changde City, entire communities had simply ceased to exist as they were. This is the story of how 363 millimeters of rain turned a quiet county into a disaster zone in less than 24 hours. To understand what happened in Sherman County, you have to understand what was already happening in the days before. Meteorological stations across the region had been tracking a massive band of moisture pushing into southern Hunan. It was the kind of sustained rainfall event that makes hydrologists start running numbers they hope they'll never have to use. This wasn't a single storm. This was day after day of relentless, soaking, ground-saturating rain falling on some of the steepest terrain in the province. By the time the heaviest bands arrived on the night of the 17th, the mountains had already absorbed more water than they could hold. The soil was full, the streams were swollen, the reservoirs were climbing, and the rain kept coming. In some monitoring areas, the 24-hour totals hit 339 millimeters. In others, they pushed past 363. To put that in perspective, that is roughly a foot of rain falling on mountainous terrain in a single day. Terrain where water doesn't pool gently, it channels, it accelerates, it finds the steepest path downhill, and it takes everything in that path with it. Officials had already been issuing warnings about dangerous flash flood conditions. They warned about the deadly combination of steep slopes and continuous rainfall, about rivers and reservoirs that were rising at speeds that made intervention nearly impossible. And then the situation changed. Sometime in the early hours of Monday morning, in a community called Hunan Province, one of the hardest hit areas in the entire county, residents began hearing something that many of them would later describe as the most terrifying sound of their lives. It wasn't the rain anymore, it was the water. Rushing, roaring, smashing water that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Some people were jolted awake by emergency alerts on their phones. Others were shaken conscious by neighbors pounding on doors and screaming to get out, to get up, to get to higher ground right now. And some in those first confused seconds of waking simply heard the sound of their front walls being hit by something enormous. The water level in Hunan Province rose so fast that roads became violent churning rivers within minutes. Not hours. Minutes. And the water wasn't clean. It was thick with mud, debris, broken timber, uprooted trees, shattered furniture, pieces of structures that had already been torn apart upstream. Entire rows of shops disappeared beneath the surge. Homes in low-lying districts filled to the second floor. In some neighborhoods, the smaller buildings vanished almost entirely. The water line reaching the rooftops, leaving nothing visible but the peak of a roof, surrounded by brown, fast-moving current. Residents who managed to get to upper stories or higher ground described looking down at streets they had walked every day of their lives and seeing something completely unrecognizable, a raging channel of muddy water carrying livestock cages, household appliances, chunks of concrete, and even small vehicles tumbling end over end in the current. The crashing sounds went on for hours. That's the part people keep coming back to. Not the water itself, but the sound. The relentless percussion of debris slamming into buildings, of cars colliding with each other as they were dragged downstream, of things breaking apart in the dark.
Kurang lebih di 1 meter, di 1 meteran orang dewasa. Dan lihat sekelilingnya sudah.
But the flooding in the towns was only one layer of this disaster, and it wasn't even the most dangerous one. Throughout Sherman County's mountain roads and rural routes, the same water that was drowning urban areas was simultaneously tearing the transportation network apart from underneath. Multiple roads collapsed entirely as rushing water eroded their foundations. Landslides buried other sections under tons of rock and soil, cutting off village after village from the outside world. In Suwaja Township, a suspension bridge that had spanned one of the swollen rivers was hit by flood currents so powerful that they destroyed the bridge's support structure completely. The bridge didn't just flood, it broke. Several other bridges across the county were either submerged beyond use or structurally compromised. Some highways and rural roads simply disappeared, covered so completely by muddy floodwater or landslide debris that they were no longer distinguishable from the terrain around them. What this meant for rescue operations was devastating. Emergency vehicles couldn't reach the communities that needed them most because the roads to get there no longer existed. In some mountain areas, rescue workers had to abandon their vehicles entirely and hike long distances on foot, carrying equipment and supplies over unstable terrain just to reach stranded residents. More than 16,000 people had to be evacuated across the county. They were pulled from flooded homes and isolated neighborhoods using inflatable boats, heavy machinery, and in many cases, sheer physical effort in conditions that were still actively dangerous. And the infrastructure damage extended far beyond roads and bridges. Electrical substations were flooded or destroyed by landslide debris, knocking out power across wide areas for hours. Water systems were compromised. Communications went down. Vast stretches of farmland that communities depended on for their livelihoods were submerged under thick layers of muddy water as rivers overflowed into the agricultural lowlands. The losses in that sector alone will take months to fully calculate. Cars that had been parked along roadsides throughout the county were found floating in currents, overturned in ditches, stacked against bridge supports where the water had pinned them. Some were found hundreds of meters from where they had been parked. As conditions continued to deteriorate, Hunan Province activated its emergency flood control measures. Sherman County raised its flood response to a level that mobilized thousands of additional emergency personnel into the affected region. Temporary shelters were established in schools, government buildings, and public halls. Emergency supplies, drinking water, food, blankets, medicine began flowing into evacuation centers. Power restoration crews and road repair teams deployed across the county, though their work was immediately complicated by the fact that the rain had not stopped and the terrain beneath their feet was anything but stable. Rescue teams continued searching flooded neighborhoods for anyone still stranded, and that work, as of the latest reports, was still ongoing. The images and videos that came out of Sherman County spread across Chinese social media with a speed that matched the floodwaters themselves. Footage showed streets transformed into full-blown rivers with white water rapids, bridges buckling and collapsing into surging currents in real time. vehicles tumbling through intersections like they weighed nothing. Residents who lived through it described the event as the worst flood disaster they had seen in decades. More than a few compared what the water did to their community overnight to a tsunami ripping through an inland county. That comparison, while extreme, gives you a sense of the psychological impact on people who watch their entire world change between midnight and dawn. And here's the part that makes everything you just heard even harder to sit with. Authorities have warned that additional rainfall is expected across Hunan Province in the coming days. It will be falling on ground that is already completely saturated, flowing into rivers that are already at or above danger levels, hitting mountain slopes that have already proven they cannot hold. The conditions that created this disaster have not gone away. They are in some areas getting worse. Sherman County is now part of a growing pattern across southern China where extreme rainfall events, flash floods, and catastrophic landslides have been striking with increasing frequency and increasing severity across multiple provinces in recent years. Each event forces massive evacuations, destroys infrastructure that takes months or years to rebuild, and leaves communities facing the question that no one can answer with certainty. When does the next one come? Tonight, the shelters in Sherman County are full. The rescue teams are still searching, the rivers are still high, and the sky over Hunan Province is still dark, with clouds that have more rain left to give. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.